There's a peculiar tension in the Pentagon right now, one that's not often visible to the public, but is unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. It's the sound of military leaders clearing their throats, choosing their words with extreme care, and finding diplomatically polite ways to say no to their commander-in-chief, or at the very least, to suggest that perhaps, just perhaps, what he's asking for isn't actually legal, feasible, or advisable. And in some cases, all three at once. This isn't the normal friction that exists between civilian leadership and the uniformed military. That's always been there, a healthy part of the system, designed to ensure that military power remains subordinate to democratic control. But what's happening now goes considerably beyond that. We're seeing uniformed officers, the people who've spent their entire careers learning to execute orders without question, drawing lines in the sand. And they're doing it in ways that are increasingly visible, increasingly bold, and increasingly necessary. The most striking example came in early January, when word leaked that President Trump had directed the Joint Special Operations Command to develop an invasion plan for Greenland. The autonomous Danish territory that Trump has fixated on since his first term, convinced America needs to acquire it for minerals, military positioning, and the satisfaction of adding another star to the flag. Trump didn't casually mention this over dinner. He formally ordered JSOC, the Elite Special Forces Command, to draw up detailed plans for invading and occupying Greenland. The Joint Chiefs of Staff pushed back hard. They argued such an operation would be unlawful, would violate international law, lacked congressional authorization, and would be an act of war against a NATO ally. Let that sink in for a moment. The President of the United States ordered military planners to prepare for an invasion of territory belonging to Denmark, a country that has been a formal ally of the United States since the founding of NATO in 1949. A country whose soldiers have fought alongside American troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. A country that, under the NATO treaty, the United States is obligated to defend. And the military brass had to explain that invading them might be problematic. The pushback wasn't subtle either. Diplomatic cables described the situation in stark terms. Senior military officials, speaking anonymously because they value their careers and prefer not to be fired via social media at 3 a.m, told reporters that the generals think Trump's Greenland plan is crazy and illegal. That's not paraphrased. Those were the actual words used, crazy and illegal, from the people whose entire professional ethos involves maintaining strict discipline and chain of command. One diplomatic cable went even further, outlining what officials described as an escalatory scenario in which Trump uses military force to sever Greenland's ties with Denmark. The cable warned that the outcome could be the destruction of NATO from the inside. Some European officials, the cable noted, suspect this is the real aim of the hardline faction around Trump. Since Congress would not allow Trump to exit NATO directly, occupying Greenland could force the Europeans to abandon the alliance themselves. If Trump wants to end NATO, this might be the most convenient way to do it. Think about that strategic assessment for a moment. American military and diplomatic officials are openly discussing whether their own president's actions are designed to destroy the most successful military alliance in modern history. And they're warning that if he keeps pushing, they're going to have to refuse his orders. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question that's been hovering over this entire saga. What happens when a president gives an unlawful order? The answer, according to military law and every officer's oath, is clear. They must refuse it. They're required to refuse it. Officers swear an oath to the Constitution, not to presidents. They're taught from day one at the service academies to distinguish between lawful and unlawful orders. And an order to invade a NATO ally without congressional authorization, in violation of the United Nations Charter that the United States helped write, would be about as clear an example of an unlawful order as you could construct. But acknowledging that theoretical possibility is one thing. Actually having to face it, Having to tell the President of the United States that you're not going to do what he's demanding is quite another. And that's the position the military is increasingly finding itself in. Senator Mark Kelly knows something about this. Kelly is a former Navy captain, a combat pilot who flew 39 missions, and an astronaut who flew 4 missions to space. He's also currently a Democratic senator from Arizona, which means he's become a target for the Trump administration. In November, Kelly joined 5 other members of Congress, all with intelligence or military backgrounds, in releasing a video that offered a straightforward reminder to service members. "Our laws are clear," Kelly said in the video. "You can refuse illegal orders." It wasn't a particularly controversial statement. It's basic military law, the kind of thing that gets briefed in basic training and professional military education courses. Military lawyers give this exact same guidance all the time. But the Trump administration didn't see it that way. Trump himself posted on social media that the video represented seditious behavior punishable by death. All capital letters, by the way, because apparently the death penalty demands emphasis. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth took it from there. In January, he announced that he was formally censuring Kelly, initiating proceedings to reduce his retired military rank and cutting his retirement pay. The letter of censure that Hegseth sent to Kelly is a remarkable document, one that reveals just how far the administration is willing to go to enforce loyalty. Hegseth accused Kelly of directly attacking the legitimacy of military leadership, of engaging in conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, and of bringing dishonor to the officer corps. And then came the kicker. If you continue to engage in conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, Hegseth wrote, you may subject yourself to criminal prosecution or further administrative action. Let's be clear about what happened here. A sitting United States senator, a decorated combat veteran, reminded service members of their legal obligation to refuse unlawful orders. And the administration responded by threatening him with criminal prosecution, demotion, and financial penalties. The message couldn't be clearer. Don't tell the troops they have the right to say no. Don't remind them that their oath is to the Constitution, not to Donald Trump. Don't suggest that there might be circumstances where they should refuse to follow orders. Kelly didn't back down. He filed a lawsuit arguing that Hegseth's actions violated his First Amendment rights, the speech and debate clause of the Constitution that protects legislators, and basic principles of separation of powers. If permitted to stand, the lawsuit argues, the censure and grade reduction proceedings will inflict immediate and irreparable harm. They impose official punishment for protected speech, chill legislative oversight, and threaten reductions in rank and pay. More importantly, Kelly pointed out what this really means. If Pete Hegseth succeeds in silencing me, Kelly said, then he and every other Secretary of Defense who comes after him will have license to punish any retired veteran of any political persuasion for the things that they say. By that logic, a 100-year-old World War II veteran could be hauled in and censured or court-martialed because he says something that Pete Hegseth disagrees with. And here's the thing, Kelly's right. What the administration is attempting to do sets a precedent that should terrify anyone who cares about civil-military relations, free speech, or the basic functioning of American democracy. Because if a defense secretary can punish retired military officers for speech he doesn't like, if he can threaten them with criminal prosecution for reminding troops about their legal obligations, then the entire balance of power shifts. Suddenly, anyone who's ever worn the uniform and receives a military pension can be silenced through intimidation and threats of financial ruin. But the Greenland plan and the Kelly censure are just the most visible examples of a broader pattern. Behind the scenes, military leaders have raised serious concerns about the Trump administration's entire defense strategy. In late September, multiple senior officers, including Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dan Kane, voiced significant reservations about the national defense strategy that Hegseth was pushing through. The concerns weren't about minor details. They were fundamental disagreements about priorities, how the military should be structured, where America's focus should be. Hegseth has been pushing a strategy that dramatically reorients the military away from overseas commitments toward what he calls homeland defense, which in practice means border security, immigration enforcement, and preparing troops for domestic operations. The military brass pushed back on this too. In a highly unusual summit at Marine Corps Base Quantico in September, Hegseth summoned top military leaders for what was described as a 45-minute speech about tougher standards and war-fighting focus. What it really was, according to multiple officials, was Hegseth laying down the law and making clear that dissent would not be tolerated. And it hasn't been. In the first 8 months of the administration, Trump fired or otherwise relieved some 15 senior military officers. The first 3 months alone saw the abrupt removal of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the chief of naval operations, the commandant of the Coast Guard, the vice chief of staff of the Air Force, the director of the National Security Agency, and the senior lawyers in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. These weren't the normal peacetime rotations or retirements. These were purges, and everyone in the Pentagon knows it. Trump fired C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and replaced him with Dan Kane, a retired 3-star general who had to be brought back from retirement and promoted to 4 stars despite not meeting the standard qualifications for the job. Kane is by all accounts a capable officer, but he was chosen precisely because he's seen as more compliant, more willing to go along with whatever Trump wants. And what Trump wants keeps getting more expansive, more erratic, and more difficult to execute legally. After the successful operation to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in early January, Trump became emboldened. He started talking openly about taking Greenland, whether they like it or not. He threatened Denmark with 25% tariffs if they didn't support American control of Greenland. He suggested that Russia or China would take over Greenland if America didn't, which is a claim that makes no sense geographically, legally, or militarily, but that hasn't stopped him from repeating it. The military's response has been to slow walk, to raise objections, to point out legal obstacles, and to generally try to convince Trump that what he wants isn't actually achievable. According to NBC News, Trump asked Chairman Kane to present potential options and impacts of using military force to seize Greenland, and ultimately decided against an invasion after being briefed on what it would actually involve. Which suggests that someone, somewhere in the chain of command, managed to talk him down by explaining that invading a NATO ally might not go as smoothly as he imagined. But here's the problem. That works only if Trump actually listens to the briefings, only if he cares about legal constraints or international law or the practical difficulties of executing an operation. And there's increasing evidence that he doesn't. Multiple officials have described a pattern where Trump demands something, gets told it's not feasible or legal, and then simply demands it again, often in increasingly public ways. It's a pattern familiar to anyone who watched his Venezuela strategy, where he demanded that American oil companies invest billions in Venezuelan oil infrastructure immediately, only to have the CEOs tell him that Venezuela is uninvestable under current conditions, and that they'd be insane to put money into a country where Trump himself just helped overthrow the government. And this brings us to the core tension that's driving all of this. Trump sees the military as his personal tool, something he can deploy wherever he wants, whenever he wants, for whatever reason strikes him at the moment. The military, meanwhile, sees itself as an institution bound by law, by tradition, by constitutional constraints, and by a professional ethic that involves a lot more than just following orders. When those two visions collide, something has to give. What we're seeing now is the military trying to find ways to manage that collision without triggering a full-scale constitutional crisis. They're doing it by slowing things down, by pointing out obstacles, by finding diplomatic ways to say that what Trump wants isn't actually possible. But there are limits to how long that can work. At some point, if Trump keeps pushing, they're going to have to make a choice. Either they follow orders they believe are unlawful, unconstitutional, or strategically catastrophic, or they refuse. And if they refuse, then we're in genuinely uncharted territory. The military isn't designed to resist civilian control. That's not its job. In a healthy democracy, the military follows orders from the elected civilian leadership, even when those orders involve policies they disagree with. But the system also has safeguards built in for precisely this scenario. Officers are taught that they have not just the right, but the obligation to refuse unlawful orders. They're supposed to report those orders up the chain of command. They're supposed to seek guidance from their legal advisors. And if necessary, they're supposed to go to Congress, which has constitutional authority over the military and which can prohibit spending on illegal operations. That's the theory anyway. In practice, it's messy, complicated, and fraught with risk. Any officer who refuses a direct order from the president, even an unlawful one, is taking a massive professional and legal gamble. They're betting that history will vindicate them, that the courts will back them up, that Congress will support them. And they're betting against the very real possibility that they'll be fired, court-martialed, and have their reputation destroyed. But some things are worth that risk. Some lines have to be held, even at personal cost. And increasingly, we're seeing military officers decide that this is one of those times. They're doing it quietly, for the most part. They're not staging public revolts or issuing dramatic resignations, but they're pushing back, they're raising objections, they're finding ways to slow things down and create space for cooler heads to prevail. 5 former secretaries of defense, representing both Republican and Democratic administrations over the past 3 decades, have called on Congress to hold immediate hearings on Trump's firings of senior military leaders. They said the dismissals were alarming, raised troubling questions about the administration's desire to politicize the military, and removed legal constraints on the president's power. These aren't partisan critics or political opponents. These are people who understand exactly what civilian control of the military is supposed to look like. And they're warning that what's happening now isn't it. The question is, what happens next? Trump has another 3 years in office, assuming he doesn't find a way to extend his term, which he's joked about often enough that it's hard to know if he's kidding. He's shown no signs of moderating his demands, no indication that he's learned from the pushback he's received. If anything, he seems more convinced than ever that he can bend reality to his will through sheer force of personality and aggressive public statements. The military, meanwhile, is being stretched in ways it hasn't been in modern American history. It's being asked to plan for operations that violate international law, to support domestic policies that blur the line between military and law enforcement, and to execute a strategic vision that most professional officers believe is fundamentally flawed. And it's being told that if it raises objections, if it reminds anyone about legal obligations or constitutional constraints, it risks being purged, censured, or prosecuted. This isn't sustainable. At some point, something is going to break. Either Trump is going to push too far and trigger a genuine constitutional crisis, or the military is going to find a way to collectively push back hard enough to establish clear boundaries. Or the political system is going to intervene through Congress or the courts. But the current equilibrium, where everyone is pretending that this is all normal, while simultaneously preparing for the moment when it becomes impossible to ignore, can't last forever. What should concern all of us is what happens if we reach that breaking point. Because once you break the basic trust between civilian leadership and the military, once you politicize the officer corps to the point where their loyalty is measured by their willingness to follow unlawful orders, you've done damage that's very hard to repair. You've created a military that either becomes a tool of authoritarian control or that decides it needs to take matters into its own hands. Neither option is compatible with constitutional democracy. The military leaders who are drawing lines right now, who are finding ways to say no to their commander-in-chief, are doing something that's simultaneously necessary and dangerous. They're necessary because someone has to stand up for the rule of law, for the Constitution, for the basic principles that are supposed to govern the use of military force. But they're dangerous because every time the military pushes back against civilian control, even when that control is being exercised badly, it sets precedents that could be abused later. This is why the Kelly censure matters so much. This is why the Greenland invasion plan matters. This is why the wholesale firing of senior military officers matters. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a pattern where Trump is systematically trying to remove anyone who might say no to him, anyone who might remind him about legal constraints or practical limitations. And he's doing it by creating an environment where the price of dissent, even private dissent, even just pointing out that something might be illegal, is professional destruction. The military can resist this for a while. It has institutional momentum, it has legal protections, and it has enough senior officers who care more about their oath to the Constitution than about their careers. But it can't resist forever. Not if Trump keeps pushing. Not if he keeps demanding operations that can't be executed legally or safely. Not if he keeps firing anyone who tells him no. So we're left in this strange, tense moment where everyone knows the situation is unsustainable, but nobody quite knows how it's going to resolve itself. The military is drawing lines, but quietly. Trump is pushing boundaries, but erratically. Congress is watching, but hasn't yet decided to intervene forcefully. And all of us are waiting to see what happens when this unstoppable force meets this immovable object. One thing is certain though, the decisions being made right now by military leaders, the choices they're making about when to push back and when to comply, are going to shape American civil-military relations for decades to come. If they can find a way to maintain constitutional order while still respecting civilian control, if they can hold the line against unlawful orders without triggering a broader crisis, then they'll have done something genuinely important. But if this goes wrong, if we end up with a politicized military or a constitutional breakdown, then we're going to look back at these months as the time when we had a chance to stop it and didn't. The military understands what's at stake. That's why they're being so careful, so measured in their pushback. That's why they're trying to find ways to slow Trump down without directly confronting him. But careful and measured only works if the other side plays by the same rules. And Trump has shown over and over again that he doesn't believe rules apply to him. So if you've been following the news and wondering why there seems to be this strange tension in the Pentagon, why military officials keep speaking in carefully worded hedges, why there are all these stories about officers raising concerns or pushing back on strategies, now you know. The military is drawing a line. They're doing it carefully, they're doing it professionally, but they're doing it. And what happens next depends on whether Trump decides to respect that line or whether he's determined to cross it. If you found this look behind the scenes at Pentagon politics valuable, hit that like button and subscribe. Because this story is far from over. And understanding what's happening between Trump and the military is going to be crucial for making sense of American politics for years to come.